Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. We are glad that you are with us. We wish to welcome you to the daily Bible study for the Silang Church of Christ. If you have been to our building, you know where we are. If, on the other hand, you are joining us from someplace else in the world or someplace else in the Philippines, we are located in the city of Silang, Cavite, Philippines, on Alganaldo Highway at kilometer 42. This makes us about 30 miles or 50 kilometers south of downtown Manila. We are glad that you are with us, and we hope that our study of God's Word is of benefit to you today. As we started our topic on Friday, we talked about the difference of grace and law. And you see, if we seek our grace through law keeping and the added performance of our own rites and ceremonies, then we are spiritually dead and we are spiritually not moving. Let's take a look at Romans chapter 3, Romans chapter 3, verse 21. Morena?
Mhm. Sir, Romans chapter 3, verse 21.
Yes, please.
Romans chapter 3, verse 21 says, "But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it."
Okay. And 22, Rochelle?
22. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe, for there is no distinction.
Okay. So what do we see? We see that the law is manifested, the grace is manifested, righteousness is manifested, separate from the law through the grace of Jesus the Christ. This is necessary and it has to be true because Romans chapter 3 and verse 10 is true. Romans chapter 3 and verse 10. Geraldine?
As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seek. Ay, yeah, only there. As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one.
How many?
Not one.
No po.
Not one. So we cannot, let me be clear, we cannot earn our salvation. Why? Because we are all sinners. In our struggle to live perfectly in reference to the law, all people who are being honest will confess as Paul did. Let's take a look at Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7. Give me verse 13. 13, please, Giselle.
Romans chapter 7, verse 13. Did that which is good, then bring death to me. By no means it was sin, producing death in me through what it is good, in order that sin might be shown to be sin, and through the commandments might become sinful beyond measure.
So, what is the purpose of the law? The purpose of the law was to show us that we were sinful, not a little bit, but beyond measure. And now we'll take a look at chapter 7 and verse 14. Furley, Romans chapter 7, verse 14.
Romans chapter 7, verse 14. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold under sin.
Okay, so the law is what? Spiritual.
Spiritual.
But we are attracted to what? Physical.
Flesh.
Flesh, okay? You see, the more we come to understand the reality that we are doomed and we are in bondage to sin, the more that we are attracted to grace. Therefore, the recognition that the law of God reveals sin in our lives and causes us to seek grace if we are honest. The law is indirectly a driving force to us seeking grace. Why? Because we realize, as Paul did, that we are all lawbreakers. And therefore, we are in bondage to sin because we are not capable of keeping the law perfectly so that we might deliver ourselves. This is what Paul meant when he wrote Romans chapter 7 and verse 9. Romans chapter 7, verse 9. Francis?
Romans chapter 7, verse 9.
Yes, please.
I was alive once without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died.
For without the law I was once alive, but when the commandments came, I died. You see, in the context of this point, we can conclude that if the law reveals the sin that's in our lives, then it might be good to live without the law. But Paul wrote Romans chapter 7, verse 7. Romans chapter 7, verse 7. Chris?
Romans chapter 7 verse 7. What shall we say then? If the law sinful? Certainly not. Nevertheless, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law. For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, "You shall not covet."
Okay. You shall not covet. You shall not steal. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not, and it goes on and on. It may seem to be a glorious theology to believe that we are not under the law. Now, there are two Christian doctrines that I want to explain, and you may want to write these down. What does anybody here remember? I'm sure I've covered it before. What is antinomianism? Cora?
I can't remember it.
Okay. Antinomianism is a Christian doctrine that holds that since we are saved by grace, we can live any way we want to. Okay? Give me a second. So what do we think the answer is to that? Can we live any way we want to?
Nope.
Oh,
But
no.
grace passes our sin, right? Cora, give us Romans chapter 6, verses 1 and 2.
Romans chapter 6, verse 1 and 2. What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? No, by no means. We are those who have died to sin. How can we live? How can we live it any longer?
Okay, now antinomianism says there is no law, that we can live any way we want to, and if we sin more, there's just more grace to cover it up, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
Somebody said yes? Who? Raise your hand.
Nomianism is believing that you can live anyway the way you want it. When
Correct.
you say antinomianism, meaning you're against it.
You are against it. That's correct.
Hmm.
Now, read antinomianism is a doctrine that holds that you can behave any way you want to because the more you sin, the more grace will increase in order to cover your sin. But if you read Romans chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, read it again for us, Cora.
What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? I think it's some verse it says may abound, but mine says may increase. By no means. We are those who have died to sin. How can we leave it in any longer?
So, are we allowed, based on Romans chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, are we allowed to live any way we want to?
Mm-mm.
No. Okay. We should not, therefore, continue to sin so that grace may abound or grace may increase. The answer is no. Now, the other doctrine that is the opposite of antinomianism is something called legalism. Does anybody know what the doctrine of legalism is?
It means you are not legalism. You have to abide with the law, meaning you have to abide what is written by in the law.
Well, they go a little bit further than that. Legalism is a doctrine that holds that you can earn your salvation. Obey the law well enough, do the things that it says, follow along with, say enough rosaries, do enough stations of the cross, pray enough prayers, give enough money, take enough pilgrimages, do all of these things, read your Bible enough times, learn enough verses. The list goes on. And you can therefore earn your salvation. Is that true?
No.
No.
Prove it.
You have to do some work.
Prove it.
Faith without work
It's dead.
is
We
dead.
do have to do work, but that's not what legalism holds. Legalism holds that you can earn your salvation. Can you earn your salvation? You said no.
No.
Prove it.
Salvation is free. Salvation is free. Matthew 28.
No. That's Matthew 28, 18 through 20 is the Great Commission. There is a verse that refers specifically to what we're talking about. Please tell me what it is.
James.
Try Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9 for us. Would you do that, please, Vanessa?
Ephesians 2, 8 and 9.
Now, you should have that one memorized by now.
God said. We tackled it yesterday. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is a gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast.
Not of
No
works.
boast.
So, by the way, on one side of the spectrum, you have antinomianism. You can live any way you want to. Incorrect. Romans chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. On the other end of the spectrum, you have legalism. Keep enough laws,
Legalism.
learn enough Bible, say enough scriptures. You can earn your salvation. Which one is correct? Left ditch or right ditch?
Either.
No, not either.
Francis gave us a hand sign. Which one is correct, Francis?
None, sir, because we
None
can't
of it.
earn our salvation.
Say it again, please.
None, sir.
So where do we want to be? Do we want to be legalistic, or do we want to hold to the doctrine of antinomianism? None of it. We want to be in the middle, right? No left ditch, no right ditch. We want to be in the middle, in between the two extremes. As you guys have heard me say before, most bad theology is an overreaction to somebody else's bad theology. We might want to believe there is no law, antinomianistic, by which we should live. Our sense of religiousness would still drive us to create our own law. Silly as this sounds, if you listen to people, they invent laws to guarantee that they're not under the law. And of course, this is really hypocritical and self-contradictory. The fact is true that God's law brings us freedom. It brings us freedom from the bondage of our own self-imposed laws that deceive us into thinking we're right with God on the basis of our own religious inventions. Therefore, as a charter of freedom, Paul wrote Romans chapter 7 and verse 12. Romans chapter 7, verse 12. Lailani?
Romans chapter 7 verse 12. So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, and the righteous and good.
Now, which law? The law of God. You see, religious leaders who impose obedience to human religious rites and ceremonies, the Jewish religious leaders reversed the order of obedience, and therefore they contradicted the very purpose for the law of the Sabbath. They made the Sabbath not about keeping the Sabbath for man and for God, but made the Sabbath about keeping their assortment of prescribed laws that are associated with it. That way, someone could be judged to be a faithful Sabbath keeper. Instead of it being a day of rest for the people, the Sabbath, with its added restrictions, by the way, more than 100 that surrounded the Sabbath, that was relegated to showing religiosity. Keeping the Sabbath, therefore, became a means of self-justification before God when combined with all of the invented religious rites that surrounded the Sabbath. The same takes place today in our religious world with those who have little or no knowledge of the word of Christ. This is often the reason why an assembly defined as Christianity has become so popular. We identify the church by the performance of certain fulfilled laws that take place on Sunday morning, that happen between an opening and a closing prayer. All such behavior is promoted by religious leaders who view grace through the lens of the law. Therefore, this is really a distorted message, and it is no different from the Sabbath-keeping zealots who confronted Jesus. What we need to do is view grace through the latter. Whatever understanding the Jews had of grace while they were living under the Levitical law, grace was eventually viewed through their law keeping. This behavior was specifically identified by their keeping all of the traditions of man. Mark 7:7. Mark 7:7, please. Morena? You can do that by memory if you like.
Mark chapter 7 verse 7. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.
Did you read it or did you do it from memory?
I just memorized it. Nothing.
You see, too many people then, in the time of Jesus and now, view grace as activated in our life by only keeping of the law. In that time, it was the Levitical law. In today's, it's their man-made doctrines. But we want to keep keeping the traditions of the fathers was connected to the Sabbath. If one sinned against any of the laws, and the Jews knew that they did, then atoning good works would sanctify from the violations. In view of sin and in order to keep the law perfectly, religious leaders instituted their own set of traditions in order to make sure that the Sinai law, including the Sabbath, had been obeyed. They worked in order for God to have pleasure in them, not because they realized that God already had pleasure in them because of his loving grace. They sought to live as the returning prodigal son in order that the Father allow him to be counted as only one of the servants. Let's go to Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. Give me 18, Rochelle.
Luke chapter 15, verse 18 says, I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you.
19, please, Geraldine.
I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.
Treat me as one of your hired servants. You see, the prodigal son had forgotten that by grace he was already an heir because he was still a child of his father. He could not work himself back into his father's grace. Why? Because he was already there. He could not work for what he had already had as the father's son. And the same thing is true of us as God's children. Romans chapter 8 and verse 17. Geraldine, Giselle.
Romans.
Romans chapter
8.
8, verse 17. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him, in order that we may also be glorified with him.
How much better can it get if we are children and heirs of God and heirs with Christ? You see, going back to picking on our legalist friends, the statement of Jesus in Mark chapter 2 and verse 27, Mark chapter 2, verse 27, Furley.
Mark chapter 2, verse 27. What's that? And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath.
The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And what caused this response? Mark chapter 2, verse 23 is what the question was. Francis.
Mark chapter 2, verse 23. Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain.
Now, you have to draw this picture in your mind. They're walking through a grain of field. They peel off some seeds. They whisk it in their hands to remove the chaff, the coating, and they started eating the grain. Somebody had a problem with that. You're in violation of the Sabbath. Why? Because I'm eating some fruit, grain in this particular case. If you're walking along the road and you pick a, I don't know, what fruit do we have that grows here? Dragon fruit, mango.
Mango. Indian mango.
You know, you pick a mango, you peel it, and you start eating it. Oh, you're breaking the Sabbath. No, I'm just eating. I'm not the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, which is the point that Paul draws to us in Mark chapter. Jesus brings out in Mark chapter 2, verse 27. You see, the Pharisees are going to come to the point when they say, give us Mark chapter 2, verse 24. Mark chapter 2, verse 24. Chris?
Mark chapter 2, verse 24.
Yes,
The
please.
Pharisees said to him, Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?
Who made it unlawful? The law of the Pharisees.
Amen.
They were nitpicking in reference to their own restrictions, not because there was a violation of the Levitical law, but because there was a violation of their own traditions. What the disciples were doing, eating grain, was lawful according to the Sinai law. If you were on a journey and according to the Levitical law, you had a right to eat the grain of the field as you walked through the field. However, you were not allowed to put a sickle to the crop. You were not allowed to harvest. But the act of them eating grain is not what motivated the Pharisees to make the accusation against the disciples. The Pharisees accused Jesus and his apostles of doing the simple task of picking out grain so they could eat it. Unfortunately, the nitpicking Pharisees said that this was work on a Sabbath, and by the Levitical law, it was not. You have to understand, the Pharisees viewed their relationship with God through the strict obedience of their interpretations of the law, not through the grace of God. And since they had elevated their own interpretations of the Levitical law to the same authority of God, if anyone disobeyed their interpretation, then it was the same as disobedience to God. And in the case of the disciples eating grain, according to the religious leaders at the time, what did they say in 224? It is not lawful on the Sabbath. So we can see in the context of the situation that Jesus reminded the religious leaders of the example of David. Because when
Correct.
David, go ahead, Cora.
Are you telling me that during those times, the Pharisees are just not interpreting the law, but they are creating their own law?
They are creating their own law.
Uh-huh.
By the way,
Just, li-
go ahead, Cora.
just like today, Catholic does that.
It's not
Or
just the
some,
Catholics, okay?
yeah, I'm not gonna say, or some other religious sector.
Okay. And since it's 40, that's a good stopping point for today. And then we'll stop the broadcast.